Welcome into the Inside Indiana podcast. This is Ken Bikoff along with Ed Magoni and Zach Osterman. And, of course, guys, we had ourselves a little bit of news for the Indiana football program. Gunner Kiel, a quarterback out of Columbus East, happens to be the top-rated quarterback in the class of 2012, commits to Indiana, snubs Alabama, snubs Oklahoma, a bunch of people. Snubs isn't the right word, but, turned down them to come to Indiana, be a little bit closer to his family. It's huge news, especially for the Hoosiers, and I think that's one thing that we need to talk about, guys, is just the fact that this is a commit that means so much more to Indiana than it would to any other program that was involved with Gunner Kiel. And, Zach, I'll start with you. Just the impact of this. You've wrote a little bit about it on the website, but, from the commit itself to the long-term ramifications of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that strikes me is, it's bigger than maybe past commitments because recruiting is covered more. I mean, it's a much more sort of recognized, covered, talked about thing than it used to be. So when Indiana gets Dave Schnell to commit out of Elkhart, that's 1985. It's not quite the same buzz, maybe, because recruiting wasn't covered the way it is now. So this recruiting has become a way to generate excitement and momentum legitimately in a college program, basketball, football, whatever these days. And to get a kid of this caliber, and also really to get a kid to stay in state. That's a problem that Indiana's had in the past, is that the best 2 or 3, 4 players usually leave the state or go to Notre Dame. Indiana sometimes is in play with those kids, hasn't had a lot of luck persuading them to come to IU. Now you look, it's not just Gunner Kiel. It's also Jordan Wallace and Kevin Davis. It's a slew of offensive linemen from the Indianapolis area. And it's just this idea that this staff, which has some Midwest ties, but certainly was not built just to recruit Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio, has convinced a lot of kids to stay closer to home that had other BCS offers. And obviously Kiel is the most high-profile one, and it's a big one. It's a big win because it was so widely publicized, because Indiana was considered from the beginning to be a favorite and has stayed in it through the end, and finally now beats out Alabama, and ostensibly some others. It's just, it's a statement. It's ideally for the staff a harbinger of things to come.
And you use the word statement right there, and I think that's one of the interesting things is, Ed, this is a staff that hasn't won a game, hasn't lost a game, but hasn't won a single game here. They haven't even opened a camp, and yet they're getting a recruit, of this caliber. Certainly the family ties helps. Certainly having his brother Dusty in the fold helps. I know his older brother is going to grad school at Indiana, but just the fact that they're able to bring in a guy like this without ever playing a game and coaching a game, I think is pretty impressive.
Well, I think that's a byproduct of Kevin Wilson's reputation for developing and producing winning quarterbacks who go on and have success at other levels. I mean, Sam Bradford, Zach Kustock from when he was with Northwestern, both those guys obviously had enjoyed much success in college and went on to, well, not Kustock, but Bradford went on to win the Heisman Trophy, and he's now a star in the NFL. So, Gunner Kiel has pro aspirations. He saw a guy who can develop pro-caliber quarterbacks and run pro-style offenses with Kevin Wilson, which he did at Oklahoma. And, I think that was a big part of it. But like Zach said, I think it is a statement not just that they got him, but it will translate into success down the road. Because Indiana, the staff isn't necessarily from the state of Indiana. I mean, some of these guys are, but for them to be able to keep the best player one of the top 10 players in the country and the best player in the state, and this is going to be IU's second Mr. Football in a row that they've gotten to commit and stay. Even with the staff change, Kevin Wilson still had to maintain the relationship with Trey Roberson, who's coming in this season, to get him on campus. Now they've got a commitment from the full-on favorite to win the next Mr. Football. Certainly says that this staff can get it done on the recruiting trail, and if they can do it on the field as well as they can do it on the recruiting trail, then IU's in good shape.
It seems too that if you look at this class of 2012, Gunner Kiel on the football side of things. On the basketball side of things, you have Hunter Perea and Yogi Ferrell and Ron Patterson and Jeremy Hollowell. All these guys just 2011 is going to be interesting to say the least. But just the fact that it seems that there is so much talent coming in, both in football and basketball, the marquee sports. Zach, just how does that change kind of the atmosphere and the way you think that fans are looking at the Indiana athletic department in general?
In a way, I think this goes back to the Big Ten Network. I mean, if you can trace it all the way back, the Big Ten Network is what allowed Fred Glass to essentially double the amount of money allotted for both the head coach in the football program and also all of his assistants, which means you can go out and hire Kevin Johns away from Northwestern. You can go out and hire Mike Eckler, who's an up and coming defensive coach at one of the premier programs in the country as your defensive coordinator. You can go out and get Kevin Wilson, who was a Broyles Award winner. I mean, on paper, Wilson's a home run, and so far he's certainly done nothing to harm his reputation. I mean, yes, he hasn't won a game yet. He also hasn't had a chance yet. I mean, and at the end of the day, in a way, I think Gunner Kiel is more marketable than a 5 or 6 win season this year, because you can take Gunner Kiel into living rooms for the next 2.5 years. You can use that name and that clout because football isn't like basketball. It's a much longer process. That's the end of the Braves-Pirates game. Ed or I will be very happy in a second. But because it's recognized that guys are going to be in college at least 3 years, and a lot of guys take at least a couple years to see the field and become adapted. It's not like basketball where there's that instant impact, constant turnover, things like that. You can really market a guy for a long period of time. And I think even if you don't see it with this class, I mean, we talked about this a little earlier tonight, not on the podcast, but we were just talking about it as a staff. They've already filled up more than half their slots for 2012. But 2013, 2014, other talented kids in the state, other talented kids in the area, you can say, look, we look at what we're doing. Look at what we've managed. We got the number one quarterback in the country. We got the best linebacker in the state, the best wide receiver in the state. We've got probably some of the best linemen in the state. So you want to come be a part of this, and I think that's a big part of it. And I know it's kind of a weird trail back to the Big Ten Network, but that Fred Glass talks all the time about why it's more important for Indiana because it's a larger, the more money it generates, that's a larger percentage of Indiana's athletics budget than, say, Ohio State. When Indiana's clearing 65 million, or making 60 to 65 million a year, Ohio State's making 120. That money's going to have a bigger impact in Indiana, and it's allowed them to do things like hire a football staff with a little bit more all-star pedigree to it, which is what translates into getting kids like this. And even, the recruiting class they'd put together before Gunner Kiel was pretty impressive in its own right. They were, again, getting kids who were turning down Cincinnati and Louisville and Illinois and Northwestern and in Pittsburgh, and in some cases, even SEC schools like Arkansas, to go to Indiana. And that's what you've got to do, is you've got to get the kids that were going to go to these 7, 8, 9, 10 win programs to come to Indiana instead. That's what you got to do in recruiting to build initially.
People discount, you mentioned the financial portion of that. People discount that, to try to fix any kind of Braves win. There you go. They've discounted that whole idea about the revenue, making a difference, in the Big Ten network and everything that goes along with that. But I think that certainly is a huge part of this equation. They have been able to spend more money on facilities along the way. That the Big Ten network certainly helped pay for a little bit of that. And it is a big deal to just be able to build everything up, and it translates eventually into more kinds of success. And now I wanted to ask both of you, the timing of this announcement. Big Ten media is gathering in Chicago. How much of an impact, Zach? Again, I'll start with you. How much of an impact is that? Because obviously Kevin Wilson can't talk about this, and Fred Glass isn't going to be able to talk about that. But when you have that concentration of people who's going to be looking for stuff to talk about Indiana, how much is the timing of this helping?
Well, I think it helps, and I don't think it was staged in any way. I mean, essentially, I think Gunner originally had, I think it was a June 12th commitment planned at his brother's camp, and then he found out there were going to be a lot of media there, and he didn't want to sort of bring media into this sort of kids camp, and so he just said, I'll do it when I do it, and it'll get out. But it certainly does help. I mean, this is a time when you can build easy momentum, I guess, is a way to say it, going into the season. And to think, I sat down and added it up today. Indiana's picked up 14 kids in 45 days. I mean, the first commitment was Alex Todd on June 12th, and the latest is Gunner Kiel on July 27th. 45 days, they've filled over half of their recruiting class. There has been just an obvious sort of building of momentum in recruiting, which again has become a much more sort of tangible, marketable asset in the grand scope of selling a program and building a program than maybe it used to be, because it's so much more widely publicized, and you can compare. You can say, well, this kid turned down all these schools to come to Indiana. So I think the timing really helps, but I think it really is more if you just kind of weave it back into what the staff has done since the middle of last month. Getting the kids that they've gotten is, this is maybe just sort of the putting the star on top of the tree a little bit, to torture a cliche.
And I wanted to ask you about the timing as well, because of the fact that, again, the season's just getting going, and there's going to be a lot of coverage of the team, but now Gunner's going to be there, much the same way that, and I hate to keep bringing up basketball when we're talking football, but I see somewhat of parallels with Cody Zeller, because IU fans are really hoping Cody would pick Indiana. He did. Now Gunner is the same way. Just your thoughts on the timing of it, and then how that'll help the program.
Well, like Zach said, I mean, recruiting has become such a hot topic, that we know who IU basketball is going to have in 2014. I mean, it's such a long term. It's not so much like that in football, but in basketball, I mean, it's certainly, you can plan a couple years down the road, but football is a little bit different animal. And the fact that all the Big Ten, like you said, I mean, they're going to be looking for information on Indiana. Indiana doesn't have a lot of wins to boast from last season. They missed a bowl game last season. The new coaching aspect of Kevin Wilson being there will obviously be a hot topic. But IU doesn't even have a name. It doesn't even have a starting quarterback name for this season publicly yet. So, Gunner Kiel is going to come up, and he's going to come up a lot. I mean, every time they say Indiana, it's probably going to be who just got a commitment from the number one quarterback in the country, Gunner Kiel. I mean, every single time that IU's mentioned in a story, it's going to have something. It's going to have a Gunner Kiel kicker on it, or some mention of him in there. And I think recruits are going to see this on the Big Ten Network. They're going to read about it on the websites. They're going to see it in the newspapers, and certainly, they're going to say, hey, they have the number one, this kid could have gone anywhere, and he chose Indiana. And this is just all going to reinforce it over and over again. And this goes back to last week's podcast where we were talking about the NFL players who are, becoming more prominent from IU in the NFL. And I think that helps. I mean, it all just one big circle. I mean, it's, because obviously Sam Bradford, from what we understand, played a role in helping convince Gunner Kiel that Kevin Wilson was a guy who can get him to the next level. And, certainly that, he never even played for Indiana. He affected Indiana's recruiting class this year. So Gunner Kiel, he's guaranteed to be here for 3 years, which is nice about football. You don't have to worry about anyone going pro after their freshman season or one and dones or anything like that. You get the guys for 3 years at least. So like Zach said earlier, I mean, you've got 3 years to market the program with Gunner Kiel. It's all going to start before he's even here at Big Ten Media Day this week. And, you can just keep parlaying that into better and better news and more top recruits and more publicity for the program, and it's all going to compound and hopefully get IU football off the ground.
Zach, you talked about this earlier before the podcast, and that's just about the whole contrast between, Alabama and Indiana, one run by Nick Saban, who's been an incredibly successful coach, but isn't somebody who's developed a lot of quarterbacks over the years. And then you have Kevin Wilson, who at Oklahoma was able to develop a couple of good quarterbacks, including Sam Bradford, a guy that was the number one overall pick in the NFL draft. How much of an impact do you think that had on the decision as well?
Well, I think it probably, and this is just me shooting from the hip here, but, as Missouri was, sort of ostensibly removed from the conversation because they took Matty Mock, and then Oklahoma was removed because they took Travis Knight, I think that's when it really ramped up, was because you did look at it, and I think, I said this off podcast, I guess would be the way to say it, if Gunner Kiel is just, a 4-star quarterback, maybe top 10, at his position in the country, then yeah, Alabama's really appealing. But if you're the number one pro-style quarterback in the country, you're 6'4", 6'5", 220 pounds, you've got a great arm, you're really accurate, you've got a good release, quick release, you're thinking about the pros. You've been thinking about being a professional. I mean, you've been to Colts camp, you've been to Elite 11, you've been to all these different things. You have been thinking about a professional future at some level for a long time. And, Alabama's offense is not one that is that conducive to developing quarterbacks. They're not going to throw the ball 35 or 40 times a game. And you don't always have to. But again, I do think that there's a difference between a really good quarterback and the guy who is basically consensus across a number of different, our scouting service, a number of different scouting services, the best pro-style drop-back pocket passer in the country. You've got to be thinking about that. And so as they, shed away Missouri, and then as they shed away Oklahoma, I think that's when, when Kevin Wilson's sort of credentials and kudos really kind of stepped up and to hear it from Sam Bradford is big. But I think when was the last time Indiana, and this is no knock on previous staffs, but when was the last time Indiana's staff had these kinds of credentials? Had a guy who could get on the phone and, get Sam Bradford to call Gunner Kiel, or I don't know how that happened. Bradford might have done it on his own, but, how often has Indiana really had a coaching staff that could do that? I think that's the big thing, and that's sort of what that's another part of the statement for this staff, is to say, this is how seriously Indiana's football staff is now taken in high-level recruiting circles.
And I want to point out, too, that, this is, we're talking about Alabama, that's our speculation. We haven't, talked to Gunner about, that aspect of the decision. So this is, I want to just make that clear, that it's not that something that Gunner told us, but just kind of our speculation on it. But, I've talked about this before. They brought in Kevin Wilson from Oklahoma. This hire is Indiana's first hire from a perennial power program that isn't, and that's not a knock on these other programs where they've brought guys in from Yale with John Pont, I think it was Yale, and in Miami of Ohio with Bill Mallory or Terry Hepner, but a perennial power, teams that are playing for national championships routinely or going for major conference championships. It's the first one since Bernie Crimmins was brought in from Notre Dame in 1952. So, that says a little something about just being able to, what that name recognition is. Even if he was an assistant, like you said, he's able to tap guys, and it's certainly something that's gonna help going forward. It helped certainly helped to bring Gunner Kiel to Indiana. It certainly is a day of big news and big excitement for Indiana football, and I know that it's something that's going to be a storyline going forward about Dusty Kiel and Gunner Kiel, the two brothers playing quarterback for the Hoosiers, and it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. Well, folks, we're out of time for right now. For Ed Magoni and Zach Osterman, this is Ken Bikoff. Thanks for listening, and pace yourself.